Tony sat in a chair against the wall, looking at his father who was lying with his eyes closed, his face thin and haggard. The atmosphere in their house had been dreary for over 3 weeks now, ever since Tony's father had become bedridden. The diagnosis was serious and time was running out. As soon as Howard's illness became known, his mother pleaded with the doctors, saying, "We'll pay any money, just save my husband. How much do you need? Let's send him abroad. I'll go with him and take care of him." Tony was unsure about the exact amount of money in their family accounts, but he knew there was a substantial sum. His father had been the head of the publishing business for many years. Normally stern and energetic, Howard was now lying with his eyes closed as if peacefully sleeping. But Tony knew that his father purposely closed his eyes whenever he entered his bedroom, not wanting to worsen the already difficult situation. Tony silently stood up and left. He understood that as soon as his father opened his eyes, even with his last bit of strength, he would express his displeasure at his presence. This had been the case the previous morning. Howard audibly complained when he saw Tony sitting nearby, saying, "Why are you looming here like an eyesore? Take an example from your older brother Vincent. He studies every day, attends all his classes, and you're idle. Go away, disappear from my sight." Those words had hurt Tony deeply. Only he knew that his older brother Vincent hadn't attended college for over 2 months and spent his spare time in clubs. Vincent would come to their father in the morning, but after an hour or even less, he would disappear, claiming he had to study. Tony heard how affectionately his father spoke to Vincent and how angrily he spoke to him. At times, Tony felt accustomed to such treatment. Since childhood, he had been the scapegoat for everyone in the family. He was blamed for all troubles and failures, regardless of whose fault it was. His father only referred to him as a slacker and a troublemaker. His brother also treated him like an enemy. Occasionally, when his mother was in a good mood, she would pity him or say a kind word after his father scolded him. On the contrary, his parents always held Vincent up as an example. Tony couldn't understand why. Tony studied diligently and got every grade deservedly, while Vincent just had to attend lessons to bring home a diary with A's and B's. Howard regularly sponsored school for Vincent's good grades. His brother was 2 years older than Tony, and as soon as he graduated from school, Howard immediately took care of it. In a couple of weeks, Vincent became a student of one of the best colleges in the city. Upon Tony's graduation, his father angrily declared, "That's it. Stop relying on your parents' support. Go to work, and if you have enough brains, go to a correspondence college." That was Tony's plan as well, but his dreams of further education quickly faded into the background. A few months after his graduation, the family learned about Howard's illness. Tony had to put aside his goals and start helping his mother. There was enough money in the family to hire a nurse, but his father adamantly refused, saying, "I deserve my wife and sons to take care of me, not some strange people." Most of the time, Howard's wife took care of him. Tony would often assist her, which would provoke the patient's dissatisfaction and anger. Together with his mother, he would wash his father, change the bedding, clean the room, and even learn to administer injections. Vincent, on the other hand, would only visit every day to sit by his father's side, holding his hand. But that wasn't the only reason. Twice, Tony overheard from another room that his brother, taking advantage of their father's favorable disposition, asked him for help. The first time, he tearfully pleaded, "Dad, the car you gave me when I finished school is no longer in good condition. It's constantly breaking down. Besides, do you know whose kids are studying in my class? The daughter of the city's head, the daughter of the son of the head doctor at our hospital, and others. They all come in fancy cars, some even with drivers, and here I am driving that damn car. Since you're bedridden anyway and your car is just sitting idle in the garage, could you give it to me? I have to maintain my family's status, don't I?" Tony hadn't heard the answer, but when he saw Vincent go out in their father's car that evening, he knew that his brother had achieved his goal. A week later, Tony was giving their father an injection when Vincent entered the room. Grudgingly, Vincent said, "Well, if you have already done your job, get out of here. I need to talk to my father." Tony left the room, but his curiosity got the better of him, and he decided to eavesdrop on their conversation. It turned out that Vincent's college arranged a week-long exchange trip abroad, and Howard, impressed by his son's enthusiasm for learning, allocated a considerable sum of money for it. Tony, who already knew that Vincent had abandoned that college, couldn't understand why his brother needed a large sum. However, everything fell into place when he overheard Vincent talking on the phone. "Baby, pack your bags," Vincent joyfully exclaimed. "As soon as I leave my father's house, we'll fly to those islands you always dreamed of visiting."
At that moment, Vincent noticed Tony and realized he had heard everything. He put the phone in his pocket, approached his brother, and hissed, "What are you looking at me like that for? I have the right to a holiday and my father doesn't mind paying for it. It doesn't matter what it's for as long as it benefits me. So, don't you dare say a word. Go and change his diapers better."
Tony was stunned by his brother's audacity. While their father lay dying in the next room, Vincent was planning a luxurious vacation on islands with his lover. "But our dad could die at any moment," Tony whispered. Vincent's reaction was chilling. He grinned and defiantly looked into Tony's eyes as he said, "Don't worry. By the time the will is announced, I'll definitely be back. After all, if he dies, the inheritance won't be received the next day." Leaving Tony in a state of confusion, Vincent turned and walked away. It was then that Tony realized that his brother had no genuine concern for their father's health. All the sadness and tears at their father's bedside were merely an act to secure the biggest share of the inheritance. A couple of days after Vincent's departure, their father passed away quietly at night, with Tony on duty at his bedside. This moment would be etched in Tony's memory forever. His father opened his eyes and looked at Tony with a kind and affectionate gaze for the first time. It was as if he wanted to say something, but after a few deep breaths, he fell silent. Tony immediately sensed that something terrible had happened. He woke up his mother, taking a sedative from the kitchen on the way, as she had been relying on them heavily lately. Sobs, farewells, and funerals followed. Throughout this time, Tony never left his mother's side. Meanwhile, Vincent continued to enjoy his leisure on the seashore, not bothering to return for the funeral. He only returned when several days had passed. He visited his father's grave only once, and that was at his mother's insistence. Life remained unchanged for him, and he even claimed to have more freedom of action. He could access cash in the safe without his father's approval, use his car whenever he wanted, and answer to no one. His mother didn't ask any questions after her husband's death. She didn't care about such matters anymore. On the day of their father's scheduled will reading, all the family members were summoned by the notary. Vincent arrived in high spirits, smirking at Tony, as if he already knew the content of the will. As for Tony, he had no illusions. But what he learned from the notary was beyond any expectations. Their father's real estate and movable assets had been divided completely, in his opinion, unfairly. The house they all lived in and the monthly maintenance had been bequeathed to his wife for life. Tony fully agreed with this part of the will. To his eldest son, Vincent, their father left the management of all accounts, businesses, multiple cars, and a spacious apartment in the downtown. When it was Tony's turn, everyone held their breath as it seemed that there was nothing more left for him. A tense silence filled the room, with Tony hearing his brother's laughter. The notary adjusted his expensive spectacles and read more quietly, revealing that their father had left Tony a stable with a small cottage located far outside the city, along with a sum of money in his account that was sufficient for him to start an independent life. When Tony heard how much his father had left him, he couldn't believe it. The number of zeros in his older brother's inheritance was many times more, and the money that had been left to Tony, his brother, could probably squander in clubs in less than a month. Tony, of course, from the very beginning realized that Dad would not divide everything equally between the sons, but he certainly did not expect him to act so unfairly. Going out of the notary, Vincent, who had always considered his younger brother insignificant, angrily sneered through his teeth, "Well, that's it, my dear little brother. As they say, go your own way, and I hope I never see you again. By the way, don't even try to ask me for anything. I'm sorry, but I don't give to beggars." Turning to his mother, he said, "Mom, are you coming? Hurry up. I've got many things to do. I'll drop you home quickly, and I want to celebrate my current status as a rich businessman." Playing with the keys of his car, which had already become officially his, he headed towards the fancy car gleaming in the sunlight. Helen approached her youngest son, taking him by the hand. She quickly said in a guilty voice, "I'm sorry, Tony, I didn't know that Howard would decide this. You know I couldn't have changed anything. You know how stubborn your father was." The young man hugged his mother and replied quietly, "It's okay, Mom. Everything will be fine. It's not about the money. I'll figure it out somehow. Just take care of yourself, and I'll definitely call you. Go, or Vincent will get upset." Helen went to the car, and Tony remained standing on the porch of the notary's office, resentful towards his father, Vincent, and the world as a whole. He couldn't understand why his father had such a negative attitude towards him from childhood until the last day of his life, which he clearly didn't deserve. Two brothers, growing up in the same family, and now one got everything while the other was left with the dilapidated house in the middle of nowhere. Tony didn't even doubt that this was how his father's inheritance looked like. After all, Howard bought this stable by chance, and he only went there for the first couple of years after the purchase. At that time, his father was obsessed with horses, and each time he came back from there, he boasted about buying another thoroughbred horse. But it didn't last long. Business took over. It started to flourish, and then his health deteriorated. In addition, Tony couldn't even remember the last time his father had visited his stable. And now he was forced by his father's will to gather his things that could fit in one travel bag, leave his home, and go to the address specified in the will. After buying a bus ticket, Tony sat in the back seat and sank into his unhappy thoughts. 3 hours later, the driver turned around, said they had arrived, and dropped him off on the main street of the village. Looking around, Tony immediately realized that his hope of finding a job here had instantly disappeared. The whole village consisted of that single central street. There were no more than 20, at most 25 houses, and they didn't look alike. Some were freshly painted with well-maintained vegetable gardens, while others were gray and shabby, as if they had endured a difficult life. Tony adjusted his bag on his shoulder and went to find his own house. At the very outskirts, a little away from the street, he saw something that resembled a house. He realized it was his property only because of the nearby stable with its overgrown fence. There wasn't even a gate in front of the house itself. It was lying on the grass. The plot was so overgrown with weeds that Tony had to clear a path, as if cutting through a thicket, to reach the porch. At that moment, he remembered his father's words, which he had said as soon as he finished school. "Well, now roll up your sleeves," his father had said with some incomprehensible threat. "Go work as a loader or a stable boy shoveling manure. That's the kind of life you're meant for. You can't rely on me or your mother. I've achieved everything on my own, and you, if you can, you'll have to fend for yourself." Now Tony stood in front of the stable house and realized that his father's words had been prophetic. Sighing sadly, the young man sat down on the broken porch step and found himself afraid and unwilling to go inside. The fear wasn't directed at anyone or anything in particular. Tony simply couldn't imagine what awaited him inside that hut, with the door hanging on one hinge, a broken window, and a torn piece of roof. Hoping to postpone the meeting with the unknown, Tony set off to inspect the stable, leaving his bag on the porch. As he approached the corner of the gray structure, he heard a horse's neighing coming from inside. At first, he thought he was imagining things. But when he opened the heavy gate, he was greeted by the handsome black horse. The horse was standing in one of the paddocks, which was the only one in perfect order. Just as Tony pondered about it, he heard a hoarse cough behind him. He turned around and saw a limping man making his way towards him. "Good day," the man said in a gruff voice. "What brings you here? Can I be of any assistance?" Tony explained who he was, briefly sharing the story of his father's death and the inheritance of the stables. "Oh, I see," the man croaked. He suggested they continue their conversation outside and pointed to a log by the gate. As they sat down, Frank, as the limping man introduced himself, lit up a cigarette and spoke. "Your father, when he bought this farm, visited for a while and bought some expensive horses. They were magnificent, you couldn't take your eyes off them. He hired workers to take care of the animals. That's when I got a job here, cleaning up manure and carrying water. Then your father stopped visiting his stable, probably when he fell ill. Instead, his assistant showed up, fired all the workers at once, and sold the horses. I remember thinking, why would your father sell everything if he loved horses so much? But that's how it turned out. Frank sighed as his cigarette burned out. Then he nodded towards the horse in the stall and continued, this one couldn't be sold right away, so he was left here. He's a young horse, but like me, he has a limp on one hoof. I felt sorry for the poor fellow and took care of him. You know, if you like. You can ask the blacksmith to take a look at him, maybe change the horseshoe, and the horse will improve. I don't know much about these things, but it seems to me that the horse is special, a thoroughbred, so to speak. Your father didn't just buy any horse. Tony sighed and promised to take care of the horse, not wanting to offend Frank. In reality, the horse was the least of his concerns. He didn't know how he would survive. He had no money, no job, and the house had been ransacked and left in ruins. He had nowhere to return to, as his brother had made it clear at the notary's office that everyone should live in his inherited house. Therefore, Tony couldn't go back to his parents' house. There was only one way out. He had to find a way to survive in this wilderness. After chatting a little more with Frank, he bid him farewell and headed towards the house. He needed to settle in before dark. However, as Tony stepped over the threshold of his future home, he was taken aback once again. He was astounded by how cruelly his father had treated him. It could hardly be called a dwelling. The small room, which had likely been a kitchen, had a broken window and was littered with cigarette butts and empty bottles. The only furniture that remained intact was a sturdy cupboard, while a table and a couple of stools were scattered around as if there had been a fight. The second room in the house seemed to have been occupied by mice for a long time. The odd cushions and blankets were in terrible condition due to their nibbling. At that moment, Tony was grateful that the bed was made of metal. Otherwise, the audacious rodents would have destroyed even the bed. There were two other things that brought him some relief: a whole window in the room and an old chest in the corner. Surprisingly, neither the mice nor the previous occupants had managed to reach it. The chest contained a couple of usable bed sheets. Although they were not new, there were men's and women's shirts, trousers. Everything was washed, but there was a faint smell of mustiness or age. For the rest of the day, he rolled up his sleeves and removed all the junk from the house, piling it in the farthest corner of the yard with hopes of burning it all someday. Then he went to the stable, where he found a decent bucket. After fetching water from the well in the yard, Tony carefully washed the room where the bed stood. He decided to start there, as it was the only place he could spend the night without worrying about raindrops falling through the broken window. Exhausted, the young man fell asleep that evening on the bare net of the old rusty bed, completely unaware of the challenges that awaited him. He woke up the next morning to the rumbling of his empty stomach. If there had been anyone else in the house, they would have heard the loud growl from outside. It was then that Tony remembered he had eaten his last meal at the bus station before coming here. He had bought a bottle of lemonade and a couple of pies with some sweet potatoes. He was about to get up when someone knocked on the window. He tried to rise but cried out in pain. He had slept so well during the night that he hadn't even noticed the iron mesh of the bed digging into his skin. Tony stood for a moment, trying to ease the pain and massage his skin before approaching the window. He opened the shutters wide and saw a female angel. She was a short girl wearing a colorful sundress that almost reached her heels and a perfectly white headscarf. She smiled shyly and handed him a package. "Hello, I'm Rachel," Frank's neighbor said, the stranger charmingly smiling. "He told me all about you yesterday, so I thought, by the time the market opens at noon, you'll starve to death. I'm going to the farm this way anyway, so I brought some milk and half a loaf of bread." Catching Tony's glance, she lowered her eyes in embarrassment and added sadly, "I'm sorry, I have nothing else to offer. My son and I live alone, so this is what we eat, and I'm excited to share it with you." Tony suddenly disappeared from the window and in a second appeared beside Rachel, taking the package from the girl's hands. "Rachel, you saved me from starving to death. I woke up thinking I was dying. I was so hungry," she smiled, and Tony continued, "I thought I'd go to the shop and buy everything, but now I realize that you don't even have one here, and I wouldn't have the energy to get to the market. You saved me, but I can't even thank you enough. I can't even invite you into my house. I'm still afraid to enter it myself. But I promise. As soon as I've put things in order, I'll invite you and your son to have tea." Throughout their conversation, Tony discreetly observed Rachel. Her features seemed familiar, but he couldn't remember where he had seen her before. Over the next few days, Tony tidied up his new home. Frank managed to find some glass somewhere, and they carefully cut it and installed it in the kitchen window. Talking about the charms of country life, the men quickly whitewashed the walls of the house, while Frank's wife cooked dinner for them. Tony was surprised at himself. He could handle the saw and hammer he had found behind the house with ease, even though he had never even suspected the existence of such tools before. In their family, there had always been hired workers to do such tasks. Now he himself fixed the table and kitchen chairs, and he even enjoyed it. Rachel visited him once, waving her hands in surprise, and said, "I thought nothing good would ever come out of this messy house. But it's still possible to live and even thrive here. You have golden hands. The only thing you need to make it cozier is a curtain for the window. I would sew them if I had something to make them from." Tony smiled mysteriously and went into the other room where there was a chest. A few minutes later, he returned with a colorful sheet. "How about using this?" he offered. Rachel, luckily the previous owners were stockpiling, and the looters didn't have much use for it. Rachel unfolded the sheet and went to the window to see how it looked. Satisfied, she said, "Why not? We won't tell anyone it used to be bedding. I'll sew them today, and we can hang them up tomorrow." Tony looked at her admirably and once again thought about how much he liked this simple country woman. Perhaps he would even have tried to court her, but Rachel had made it clear from the first day that they could only be friends. Tony had already learned that Rachel was married before, but it had been brief and unsuccessful. When he asked her to tell him about herself, Rachel reluctantly shared her story. "Before the wedding, my husband used to treat me like a princess," she said sadly as they sat on a bench outside the house. "But as soon as we got married, he changed completely. He started hanging out almost every day and chasing after other women. I endured it for a long time, crying and begging him to change, but I couldn't make a difference. Even when I became pregnant, it didn't make him reconsider his life. When my son was just 3 months old, that scoundrel became even more audacious and openly flirted with a village woman named Howard. Then they went with her to the city. Since then, Billy and I have been living alone." When Tony asked her where her son was, Rachel said that Frank's wife was helping him. So when she had to go to work, she looked after the boy. Rachel herself worked as a milkmaid for a local farmer and went to the cowshed every morning at dawn. A few days later, while walking with Billy, she checked on Tony and he quickly found a common language with the little boy. Tony was grateful to have met Rachel. Communicating with her was effortless. She often gave him gardening advice, explaining how and why to take care of the plants. She also recommended a blacksmith to help with the clips, the horse Tony had inherited. The cost to change the horseshoes was significant for Tony's small budget, but nevertheless, he decided to proceed and never regretted his decision. When Frank saw how fast Eclipse was galloping, he exclaimed, "Oh, I've told you, this young spirited horse. I wish I could change my shoes and not limp anymore." Tony smiled back. He had liked Frank from the first day. He didn't drink and was skilled at everything. Frank helped him fix the stable fence and taught him how to repair the roof. "Do you know why I'm lame smoking a cigarette?" the elderly man asked Tony. "I fell off the roof when I was young. Back then, my army buddy and I were working hard. We built houses, repaired them when needed, made good money. By the way, we were young and foolish. One day, after having a few shots in the autumn cold, we climbed onto the scaffolding. I didn't even realize what went wrong, but I fell in no time. My friend wasn't hurt at all, but the doctors had to pick up pieces of my leg and save it. Since then, I don't drink alcohol, but unfortunately, I can't make my leg healthy again." Tony enjoyed listening to his elderly neighbor. He had a way of telling stories that were captivating. They often sat by the stables in the evening with Frank puffing on a cigarette, reminiscing about the past. During these months, Tony found himself glad to be in this village. The people here were different from city dwellers, simple, kind, living a quiet and measured life without excesses or fuss. Tony was pleased with the house that he had gradually fixed up. It had become quite comfortable to live in. His resentment towards his brother had gradually faded, and he kept his promise to call his mother from time to time. During their last conversation, Helen expressed concern about Vincent. "Oh, Tony, I'm worried about your brother. He completely abandoned his studies. He doesn't want to work either. He handed over his father's business to his friend and is just living off the interest. He spends his nights drinking and partying with the money. He mentioned you several times. He said you'd starve to death, and that even if you come crawling back on your knees, he won't give you a penny." "Don't worry, Mom," Tony said cheerfully. "I'm not going to crawl, and I'm sure I won't starve to death. Everything is fine with me, even better than I expected at that moment." He wasn't lying. He said how he truly felt. He felt good and at ease. The only thing that saddened him was the lack of job opportunities, but he was almost certain that things would change soon. And change did come soon. That day, despite the early morning, Tony was already on his first crop in the vegetable garden when Rachel rushed into the gate. She was waving a piece of paper and speaking excitedly. "Tony, look what I found. I went to the chief of our farmer for his pay, and I saw this leaflet lying there. Read it quickly. It's an opportunity for you and Eclipse." Tony took the leaflet, which had a herd of horses at its center and an announcement below. It turned out that a horse show was being held in the neighboring town. The requirements were minimal, but the main prize was substantial. After reading the text, Tony grinned and handed the sheet back to Rachel, saying, "There will probably be thoroughbred horses exhibited there, and our Eclipse is only a thoroughbred, according to Frank's words." Rachel tried to persuade him for a while, but then she waved her hand, placed the leaflet on the porch, and left a bottle of milk on it. Turning around, she disappeared behind the gate as quickly as she had appeared. Tony returned to his work. However, the thought of the horse show lingered in his mind. The prize money, by village standards, was substantial, and although he didn't believe in success, Tony decided to give it a try. Frank's words about his father only buying purebred horses, which meant that Eclipse could be purebred, stuck with him. In the remaining days before the exhibition, Tony carefully prepared the horse, and Frank gladly assisted him. On the appointed day, they stood in line with the other participants, filled with excitement. The competition was fierce, with each horse being more beautiful than the next. At each stage, they had to showcase the horse's best qualities. Surprisingly, Eclipse won the hearts of almost all the judges. Tony was astonished when his pet horse was declared the winner. Right after the awards ceremony, an older man with gray hair approached Tony and gently stroked the smooth mane of Eclipse. He said thoughtfully, "He's so beautiful, you know. This breed is very rare, and only a few have been brought to our country from abroad. Such a horse is valuable, believe me. Would you consider selling him? I would pay a good price." When the man named the amount he was willing to pay for Eclipse, Tony realized that his father hadn't totally deprived him of inheritance as he had thought. The horse had already brought in, and could still bring in, a lot of money. As Tony pondered the events that had unfolded, the man continued to stroke Eclipse. Finally, the young man responded firmly, "No, I won't sell the horse. He was inherited by me, and he is like a memory of my father." In his mind, Tony was already envisaging taking Eclipse to future tournaments. After all, having won such a prize once, why not try his luck again? Tony had even imagined how he would use the money he had won to create his own small farm and live comfortably like others. However, his thoughts were interrupted by the same gentleman. "You know, I knew your father very well. My name is Mr. Sheldon. We started our business together when we were young, and we were friends. We had been friends since our student days. We studied together. Those were good times. We shared all our joys and sorrows. It was surprisingly easy for both of us. Many people even envied us. But then, years later, our paths diverged, and we lost touch," the stranger said, his voice filled with sadness as he seemed to reminisce about the past. At that moment, Tony found himself torn between wanting to hear about his father's past and not wanting to dwell on it. He was about to bid farewell when the stranger spoke again. "You know, I recently read in the newspaper about your father's death and your family. Something puzzled me. Although I hadn't spoken to Howard in many years, I know for a fact that he didn't have two sons but a daughter and a son. He was overjoyed when his daughter was born first. He said she would be his little princess. And when his son was born a couple of years later, Howard was ecstatic. We were still good friends then. Our children were born around the same time. Howard's daughter was born in early April, and my eldest was born a month later in May. We used to joke, "When they grow up, we'll merge our businesses by getting them married, but I don't have a sister," Tony interrupted. "I only have Vincent, my brother." "It's true he was born in the same year when you say your daughter was born." Mr. Sheldon looked at Tony intently and continued thoughtfully, "You know, young man, those were troubled times. There were problems in business, among other things. Howard and his family disappeared from the city. No one really knew what happened. Suddenly, your family vanished for a couple of years and then reappeared. But instead of a daughter, Howard had an older son. People gossiped, but eventually they moved on with their own lives, dealing with their own problems as best they could." After a moment of silence, the man turned his attention back to the horse, stroking its beauty. In a half-whisper, he spoke mysteriously to Tony, "But what confused me even more than the substitution of a daughter for a son was your father's attitude towards horses. You know, it intrigued me from a young age. Howard adored horses and treated them like deities. He carefully selected each of his prized horses, knowing their pedigrees and providing them with ideal living conditions. When he returned, many of our mutual acquaintances noticed how much he had changed. At first I didn't believe it, but when I saw the condition of his stables, I was shocked that your father had allowed them to fall into such disrepair." Tony listened intently, trying to make sense of it all. It was unfathomable to him how his father had allowed the stable to ruin. Moreover, the revelation that his older sister, who should have existed according to the stranger, had vanished raised questions about his family's past. The conversation with his father's friend at the exhibition left Tony's mind in turmoil. However, upon returning to the village, he became engrossed in new concerns, and the investigation into the mystery of his family would have to be postponed for another time. With the winnings he received thanks to eclipse Tony, with the help of Frank, his wife, and Rachel, set up a small farm. Though modest in scale, it provided him with enough to live comfortably. Rachel left her job with the farmer to join Tony, and while he tried to court her again, they realized that their relationship could only be one of friendship. But he was happy, and such a relationship was somehow easy for him. Nearly a year had passed since Tony moved to the village, and he couldn't imagine how he had ever lived in the bustling, noisy, and wicked city. However, one day he received an unexpected call from his older brother. From the first moments of their conversation, Tony sensed that Vincent still harbored hatred for him and seemed to call solely to mock him. "Well, little brother, aren't you starving yet?" Vincent asked. Then, noticing the farm behind Tony through the video call, he continued in astonishment, "Have you been hired as a cattle farmer?" "Yeah, where else could someone like you find work?" Tony informed Vincent that it was his own farm and stable. Vincent fell silent abruptly, cutting off his prepared speech. It was clear that his anger overflowed. Things had not turned out as he had hoped. Not only had Tony not starved to death, but he had also become a businessman, albeit in the village and without million-dollar profits. Clearly, this fact pained the older brother so much that he decided to visit that very day, supposedly to check on him. Throughout this time, Tony couldn't shake the thought that he had an older sister somewhere. But then, who was Vincent to him? Tony concluded that his brother's arrival came at the right moment, as it presented an opportunity to collect material for a DNA test. He carefully took a cigarette butt left by Vincent in the ashtray, as well as the glass from which he had been drinking. Tony even managed to collect a few hairs from the headrest of the driver's seat, while his brother inspected his possessions. Immediately after Vincent's departure, Tony went to the city and submitted all the necessary materials for the kinship test. He anxiously awaited the results. It was a time filled with both excitement and agony. Tony had no idea what the test would reveal, but he was certain that there was some mystery involved. The DNA results indicated that Tony and Vincent were complete strangers to each other, having no trace of a familial relationship. Upon receiving the result, Tony sat down on a bench in the square in front of the clinic, staring at the document, unsure of what to do next. It was obvious that there was some thought-out machination, but it would be impossible to solve it on his own. After sitting for some time, Tony placed the result sheet into his inner pocket and headed to the nearest police station. There, the investigator listened attentively and suggested filing a detailed statement. At that moment, Tony had little faith that anyone would take up his case. He believed it would likely be shelved and eventually forgotten. To his surprise, just a few days later, he was summoned to the police station, into the investigator's office. Vincent was sitting anxiously, appearing much less confident than before. He seemed frightened and suddenly began whispering rapidly, as if afraid of not being able to relay everything in time. "Tony, what nonsense are they talking about? This man interrogated me for half an hour, asking if I knew any missing businessmen who were supposedly your parents. He claims that you're not my brother at all. It's ridiculous, we've always been together. He's questioning our mother right now." At that moment, Tony didn't believe Vincent, even though his brother's appearance clearly indicated that he was in shock upon hearing the news. Helen spent several hours with Detective Shields. Tony grew concerned for her as her health had noticeably declined after their father's death. When she emerged from the investigator's office into the corridor, it was alarming to see her. She looked as if she had aged another 10 years, with a stooped back, red eyes from crying, and a dull gaze. Ignoring her sons, the woman slowly staggered out, and the investigator invited Tony into the office. "My name is Detective Poe Shields. What a job you've given us," began the policeman, motioning for them to sit down. "You have no idea what happened. It turns out that your so-called parents are not your natural parents. This family worked for your real parents as servants, and these monsters have been planning their crime for a long time, jealous of your parents' wealth." The investigator took out his tape recorder and said, "Here, you can hear the whole thing for yourself. Your so-called mother, afraid of ending her life behind bars, confessed everything." The investigator went to sort out some folders in a cupboard against the wall, and Tony listened, not believing what was happening. "My husband and I were thinking at the time," said a familiar female voice from the dictaphone. "Why do they get everything and we get nothing? So my Howard set it up. He was clever. When the owners went somewhere, they sometimes asked Howard to drive them. This time he had to drive them again. At breakfast he gave me some powder and told me to put it in the tea of both the owners. And after they left to be ready in a couple of hours, he came back nervous, twitchy. He asked me to get all the kids in the car quickly. There were only 3 of them in the house, their daughter, their son, and Vincent. Without asking unnecessary questions, I did everything as ordered. In a few hours we were far from the city where we lived. There, in a small hotel, Howard told me that there were no more owners, and now we'd be instead of them. But of course, it still required great effort, appearance, and age. We were something like them, but the beauticians and plastic surgeons did some other things." The recording stopped halfway through, and in the ensuing silence, the investigator's voice came from behind him. "Oh damn, it's run out of power. She has been talking about their crime for so long. Let me recharge it. Why don't I pour you some tea? You need time to adjust to this terrible truth." Handing Tony a cut glass, he said, "You sit closer and listen to it plugged into the socket." Then Detective Shields continued to go through the documents in the cupboard, and Tony began to listen further. Howard thought everything out in advance, the false mother continued, and managed to take a lot of money from the former owners. "We went to a big house hundreds of kilometers from the town where we lived. Howard said we should wait some time. Then we found a village orphanage somewhere along the road where we were traveling. My husband said we couldn't get rid of both at once, it would be suspicious, and so they might ask. He made up a story that we were on a trip and our daughter died suddenly, so we adopted a boy to ease my maternal grief. When we returned sometime later, we had no difficulty in communicating with acquaintances, for we had been there for many years and knew well the habits and tastes of our hosts." Howard quickly entered the role and easily got into the image of the host. "And we would have lived like that if you didn't dig." The voice in the dictaphone sighed and fell silent. Detective Shields went to the table and pressed the off button. Touching Tony's shoulder, he said, "Hang in there. I understand it's hard to find out that the people you thought were your parents are not parents but murderers. But the main thing is that you found out that you have a sister. I think we'll try to find her." Tony, who had been in a sort of stupor all this time, seemed to come to his senses and, raising his eyes to Detective Shields, pleaded, "Please help me find her. After all, she is the only person in the whole world who is really dear to me." He would have started the search himself, but he didn't know where to start, so he decided to wait, leaving it entirely to the police. Every day, his thoughts returned to what he had heard in the investigator's office. A little over a fortnight had passed. During that time, he didn't see his brother or his so-called mother again. One morning, while he and Frank were cleaning the stable, Detective Shields appeared on the doorstep. "Hello, everyone," he began in a cheerful voice. "And I have good news for you, Tony. Why don't you make me some tea? I'll tell you everything I've learned about your sister." Tony's pitchfork nearly fell out of his hand. He was afraid to hear that his sister, as well as his parents, were gone. However, looking at the cheerful policeman, he calmed down. It was clear that he had come with good news. Setting down his instrument, he invited the guest into the house. It turned out that Tony's sister had been adopted by a childless couple many years ago. After being placed in an orphanage to avoid unnecessary gossip, the family had moved to the countryside and lived just 2 villages away from where Tony now resided. Excitedly, Tony asked, "Please tell me, is she alive? Does she still live there?" But the policeman just laughed, placed his hand on Tony's shoulder, and sat him down. "Calm down," he continued jokingly. "There's no need to go anywhere. Your sister is alive. Unfortunately, her parents are no longer alive, so she has moved. But you won't believe where." Tony looked at him questioningly, and the policeman, as if testing his patience, revealed information gradually. At that moment, the kitchen door swung open and Rachel appeared on the threshold, radiating happiness. "Well, I'd like you to meet her," said Detective Shields. "She is your very real sister." Rachel smiled, and Tony felt like he was in a dream. Everything that was happening seemed unreal but kind and happy. Now it became clear to him why Rachel's face seemed so familiar. That day, the 3 of them sat in the kitchen for a long time discussing everything they had learned. As they were about to leave, Detective Shields offered to give Rachel a ride home. They said goodbye to Tony, and Tony could hardly sleep that night. There had been so much information lately that his head was about to burst. The most important thing was that now he had his own sister and a wonderful nephew. From that day on, Tony noticed that Paul began to visit their village frequently. That day after work, they were going to have dinner at Tony's house. They often gathered there. Now, when Paul appeared on the doorstep with a huge bouquet of flowers, he nervously addressed Tony, "Here's the thing. I have fallen in love and want to marry Rachel. Rachel has already given her consent." Tony put on a serious expression and then, barely restraining a smile, said, "Of course I don't mind. But according to tradition, the eldest members of the family have to arrange their private lives first." Saying this, he approached the woman standing at the stove, embraced her, and whispered, "Quickly, you agree to be my wife, don't you?" Tony had been in love with Danielle, a veterinarian who had come to examine Eclipse, for 3 months already. He took great care of his horse, considering it a talisman of happiness. He had also met Danielle thanks to Eclipse. During all this time, Tony had been planning to propose to Danielle but couldn't muster the courage. Now, he thought it was the perfect moment. That evening, the small house felt especially warm in the cozy kitchen, and a month later they had a lively village wedding. After the wedding, everyone decided to stay and live in the village. Tony received the inheritance that had been misappropriated by Vincent and his mother, but instead of returning to the city, he sold everything and expanded his farm, giving half of it to his sister. He learned from Paul that his unmarried mother had moved in with Vincent, who, left without money, had been living on odd jobs and drinking. However, Tony was not interested in this at all. He became the happiest man, loving his sister, adoring his wife, and eagerly preparing to become a father. And for all of this, he was grateful to Eclipse.